Totemist.
Good evening, dear mortals. I am the totemist. Long ago, I lived countless human lives in my dreams and faced unfathomable horrors. Tonight, I shall share a few of those with you. May you live in peaceful times. Isabel. Time becomes liquid in hospitals. Each moment stretches and contracts like a living thing, marked only by the methodical drip of IV fluids and the hollow echoes of footsteps in sterile corridors. In Hospital San Rafael, where the mountains of Monterey pierce the clouds like ancient guardians, I learned how reality could slip between your fingers like water. The fluorescent lights painted everything in a clinical pallor that made even the healthiest visitors look unwell. I hadn't seen my natural skin tone in weeks. Between the harsh lighting and my condition, I'd taken on the same institutional paleness as the walls around me. My flesh seemed to be slowly surrendering to the hospital's own spectral palette, as if the building itself was gradually claiming me. My room, 317, had become a universe unto itself, a space where time operated by different rules. The window offered a view of the mountains, their peaks threading through low-hanging clouds like sleeping giants beneath cotton shrouds. During my more lucid moments, I'd watch the weather patterns shift and change, marking time in the only way that still made sense. Sometimes, in the strange hours between midnight and dawn, the mountains seemed to breathe with their own rhythm, expanding and contracting against the ink-black sky. Dr. Ramirez visited each morning at precisely 8:15, his clipboard an extension of his methodically professional demeanor. "How are we feeling today, Mr. Navarro?" he would ask, while Nurse Inez checked my vitals with practiced efficiency. Their routine was clockwork, a mechanical dance of medicine and monitoring that structured my days. They moved through my room like actors in a well-rehearsed play, their movements so precise they seemed almost ritualistic. The pneumonia had started as a slight cough during my business trip, a subtle warning I chose to ignore. I'd dismissed it, attributing the weakness to travel fatigue and the altitude change, the way we often rationalize the first whispers of approaching calamity. By the time I admitted something was wrong, the infection had wrapped itself around my lungs like ivy claiming an old building, each breath becoming a careful negotiation with my reluctant respiratory system. Recovery was slow. My body had become a stranger to me, a landscape of unfamiliar sensations and mysterious rhythms I could no longer interpret. Nights were the worst. Sleep became as elusive as smoke, slipping through my fingers despite exhaustion weighing on every cell. The darkness seemed to breathe with its own rhythm, expanding and contracting in the spaces between the monitor's steady beeping. The ceiling tiles above my bed transformed into a grid of possibilities, each square a portal to another sleepless hour. In those endless nights, my thoughts would spiral into labyrinths of memory and regret, each turn revealing another moment I could have chosen differently. I began counting things: ceiling tiles, heartbeats, the steps nurses took between stations during their rounds. The night shift moved differently than the day staff, slower, more deliberate, as if they were moving through the water instead of air. Their footsteps echoed differently in the hollow hours between midnight and dawn, each sound carrying traces of stories I couldn't quite grasp. She entered my room with such quiet grace that the air barely stirred. Her uniform was impossibly pristine, every crease sharp enough to catch light, white enough to make the fluorescence seem dim in comparison. Her name tag read Isabel, the letters somehow more defined than they should have been under the harsh hospital lighting. "You should be sleeping," she said, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone used to being heard without having to raise their voice. Something about her presence made the room feel larger, as if the walls had exhaled. "I've forgotten how," I replied, attempting humor, but hearing the truth in my own words. The confession hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken understanding. She checked my charts with careful attention, her movements precise and unhurried. "The mind remembers things the body forgets," she said, "and the body remembers things the mind wishes to forget." Her words seemed to carry weight beyond their meaning, resonating with something deep within my fever-addled consciousness. The mechanical chorus of medical equipment seemed to recede when she was present, becoming background music to our quiet conversations. Night after night, Isabel's visits became an anchor in my untethered world of sleeplessness. She would appear like clockwork, though I never heard her approach. Our conversations unfurled like delicate origami, each fold revealing something new, each crease holding secrets neither of us fully understood. She told me about growing up in a small village in the mountains, where her grandmother taught her about healing. "Medicine isn't just in pills and procedures," she explained one night, adjusting my IV with practiced care. "It's in the space between people, in the stories we share." Her hands moved with a certainty that seemed to belong to another era, each gesture precise and purposeful. I found myself telling her about Lucia, my fiancée, who decided love wasn't enough when my startup failed. "She said she fell in love with my potential," I confided. "I guess the reality didn't measure up." The words tasted bitter, but Isabel's presence made them easier to speak, as if she could somehow transmute my pain into something more bearable. Isabel's eyes held something ancient and knowing, depths that seemed to reach beyond the confines of our sterile hospital room. "Sometimes people leave so we can find our way back to ourselves," she said, straightening my blanket with those perfectly steady hands. Her touch, even through the hospital linens, carried a certainty that made the rest of the world feel less substantial in comparison. The nights blended together, but Isabel remained constant. Her uniform never showed a wrinkle, her composure never wavered. Even in my feverish moments, she was a fixed point, more real than the shifting shadows that played across my walls. Her presence had a weight to it that anchored me when reality seemed most fluid, most uncertain. Recovery came gradually, then suddenly. One morning, Dr. Ramirez announced I could be discharged the following day. "Your lungs have cleared remarkably well," he said, genuine pleasure warming his professional tone. Nurse Inez smiled as she took my final readings, the familiar ritual now tinged with the bittersweet knowledge that it would be the last time. "I'd like to thank Nurse Isabel before I go," I said. "The night nurse. She helped me through some difficult nights." The words felt strangely inadequate to describe what her presence had meant during those long, dark hours. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Dr. Ramirez and Inez exchanged a look I couldn't quite interpret, something passing between them that made the air feel suddenly thin. "There must be some mistake," Inez said carefully. "We don't have a night nurse named Isabel." Her voice carried a note of concern that made my skin prickle. But she's been here every night, I insisted. Even as I spoke, I felt something shifting in my understanding of reality, like tectonic plates grinding beneath the surface of consciousness. Dr. Ramirez frowned, making a note on his clipboard. "I'll check the staff records," he said, his tone neutral but his posture tense. The promise hung in the air like smoke, making the familiar room feel suddenly strange. Hours later, he returned with an old leather-bound book, its pages yellow with age. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it to a marked page. There, in faded ink, was a staff photo from 1923. In the center stood a nurse in an immaculate white uniform, her pose formal, but her eyes holding a familiar, gentle wisdom that reached across the decades to touch something in my soul. The caption read, "Isabel Mendoza, head night nurse, 1918-1923. My breath caught in my throat, not from pneumonia this time, but from recognition. The hospital suddenly felt different around me, as if the walls had shifted slightly, revealing glimpses of another time layered beneath the present like pentimento in an old painting. Every shadow seemed to hold memories that didn't belong to me, yet felt intimately familiar. That night, my last in room 317, I waited. The shadows lengthened, the monitors beeped their steady rhythm, but Isabel didn't appear. Only the moon visited, casting precise squares of light through the window onto the floor, like pages from a story that had reached its final chapter. As I packed my belongings the next morning, I noticed something on the bedside table that hadn't been there before. A single white origami crane, folded from what looked like starched uniform fabric, impossibly crisp and pristine. Beneath it lay a note written in elegant, faded script. Sometimes healing comes from being heard by someone who understands both the light and the darkness. The mountains outside my window disappeared into the morning mist as I left the hospital, their peaks invisible but present, like memories that live in the spaces between what we can explain and what we know to be true. The world seemed different now, as if Isabel's presence had altered not just my understanding of reality, but reality itself. Novias Elegantes. Memory plays strange tricks in places that exist between reality and dream. Sometimes I wonder if Novias Elegantes was ever real at all, or if it emerged from some collective unconscious where bridal shops materialize from pure longing, their windows reflecting both hope and something darker, something that watches from behind painted eyes and porcelain smiles. The shop stood at the corner of two narrow streets in Mexico City's historic district, its weathered facade holding centuries of stories behind leaded glass windows. Those windows seemed to breathe in the early morning light, exhaling promises of forever in clouds of white lace and tulle. I remember how they reflected both sunshine and shadows with equal ambivalence, as if they couldn't quite decide which realm they belonged to. I needed this job more than I cared to admit. When Mrs. Vega hired me, her dark eyes studying my resume with the intensity of someone reading ancient runes, I felt a flutter of relief beneath my ribs. "Very well, you'll start Monday." The shop itself was a labyrinth of fabric and dreams. 3 floors of vintage architecture where every corner held the possibility of discovery or disquiet. Sunlight filtered through high windows, creating pools of radiance that transformed simple fabrics into otherworldly artifacts. My job was simple enough: assist customers, maintain inventory, and ensure the displays looked immaculate. But from my first day, something about the place tugged at the edges of my consciousness, like a loose thread begging to be pulled. That's when I first noticed her. The mannequin stood in the corner of the second floor, wearing a vintage dress that Mrs. Vega said dated back to the 1920s. Unlike the other blank-faced figures populating the shop, this one possessed an uncanny vitality that made my skin prickle whenever I passed. Her features were delicate, almost porcelain-like, with eyes that seemed to hold secrets in their painted depths. Her pose suggested movement captured mid-motion, as if she'd been frozen while adjusting her veil, trapped between one moment and the next. "That's our special lady," Maria, my co-worker, told me during training, her voice dropping to a whisper despite the empty shop. Mrs. Vega's grandmother had her custom made in Paris. Something in Maria's tone suggested there was more to the story, but she quickly moved on to explaining the filing system, leaving my questions to echo in the spaces between display cases. Days blended into weeks, each one adding another layer to my understanding of the shop's rhythms. I learned the way sunlight painted patterns across the floor throughout the day, creating shadow maps that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere at once. I memorized the particular creak of the third step on the main staircase, a sound like a suppressed secret trying to escape. The other mannequins became familiar presences, their blank faces as predictable as old friends. But no matter how familiar everything became, that one mannequin never stopped drawing my attention. Sometimes, when organizing inventory in the evening, I could swear her head had turned slightly, or her fingers had shifted position on the lace bouquet she held. The changes were always subtle enough to doubt, like trying to remember the details of a dream while it slips away in morning light. "Carmen," Mrs. Vega called one Friday evening as I was preparing to leave. The shop had grown quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like held breath. "I need someone to do inventory next Thursday night. Double pay." She paused, watching my reaction with those inscrutable eyes. "The whole collection needs to be cataloged for insurance." My bank account made the decision before my mind could process the request. "Of course," I replied. Thursday arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to seep through the shop's old walls. I worked methodically, checking off items on my list, trying to ignore the way the mannequins' shadows stretched across the walls like reaching fingers, or how the silence seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. At midnight, I reached the second floor. Something felt off, but I couldn't immediately identify what had changed. The vintage dress display stood empty, a void that seemed to pull at my vision like a black hole. Both mannequins, the lifelike one and her companion, had vanished. My first thought was robbery, but nothing else was disturbed. The dresses hung in perfect order, the jewelry cases remained locked, and the security system showed no signs of breach. Fear crept along my spine like cold water as I searched each room, finding nothing but deeper shadows and more questions. The air felt thick with possibility, heavy with the weight of untold stories. Then I saw it, a thin line of darkness beneath the main staircase, suggesting a door I'd never noticed before. My flashlight revealed an old brass handle, tarnished almost black with age. Everything in me screamed to leave, to wait until morning. But curiosity pulled at me like a physical force, like a thread woven into my very being that someone or something was slowly drawing taut. The door opened with a sound like a sigh, or perhaps a whisper of warning. Stairs led down into darkness, the air heavy with the scent of old fabric and something metallic that caught in the back of my throat. My flashlight beam carved through the shadows, revealing a storage room whose walls seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Shelves lined with boxes of veils and vintage accessories created strange geometries in the darkness, their contents hinting at histories better left unexplored. And there, in the center of the room, stood the missing mannequins. Or rather, one stood. The other lay scattered across the floor in pieces, her limbs arranged in a pattern that seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. Her face, once bland and unremarkable, now wore an expression of frozen horror that seemed too real to be manufactured, too human to be mere plastic and paint. The other stood over the dismembered figure, her delicate features transformed by what I could only describe as satisfaction. In the beam of my flashlight, her painted lips curved upward in a smile that held no warmth, no mercy, only a terrible understanding that stretched across decades like a bridge made of nightmares. I backed away slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The mannequin's head turned, not the subtle shift I'd imagined before, but a deliberate movement that defied everything I knew about reality. Her eyes met mine, and in that moment, I understood why she seemed so lifelike. Whatever gazed at me through those painted eyes had never been anything as simple as plastic and paint. It was something older, something that had learned to wear the shape of a mannequin the way some creatures learn to wear human skin. My hand found the doorknob behind me. As I pulled the door shut, I caught one final glimpse of that terrible smile and heard what might have been a laugh, or perhaps just the settling of old wood in an aging building. The sound followed me up the stairs, echoing in my mind like a forgotten lullaby. I left my resignation letter on Mrs. Vega's desk that night, along with the inventory sheets I'd managed to complete. My hands shook as I wrote, but I forced myself to finish the task. Professional to the end, even in the face of impossible horror. Mrs. Vega called the next day. "I understand," she said, her voice carrying a weight I hadn't noticed before. "She doesn't mean any harm, you know. She just gets lonely sometimes. Time moves differently for her kind." I never returned to Novias Elegantes. And yet, when I pass by clothing shops, I find myself studying the mannequins in their windows. I look for signs of life in their painted eyes, for hints of movement in their posed limbs. And sometimes, just sometimes, I catch a glimpse of something familiar in their frozen smiles. A knowledge that speaks of patience and waiting and the terrible loneliness of standing still while decades drift past like fallen leaves. The Cricket Song. Memory has a way of preserving certain moments in perfect clarity, while others fade like old photographs left in the sun. But that night at the crossroads remains crystallized in my mind, untouched by time's erosion. I was 12 then, living in a small town in Oaxaca, where the mountains cupped the valley like protective hands, and the cornfields whispered secrets in the wind. Being the smallest boy in my class painted a target on my back that no amount of trying to blend into the background could erase. The other boys, especially Marco and his friends, seemed to sense fear the way sharks detect blood in water. They circled me in the schoolyard, their taunts as rhythmic as playground rhymes. Cobard! Cobard! Coward. My mother always said I was just sensitive. Some hearts feel things more deeply, she would tell me, smoothing my hair after another day of coming home with tears I couldn't quite hold back. But sensitivity didn't explain why my legs turned to water whenever Marco's shadow fell across my desk, or why my voice disappeared like morning mist when the teachers asked me to speak in class. The small mercies of my days came in unexpected places. The stray cat that let me feed it behind the school kitchen. The library, where dust motes danced in sunshine streaming through high windows. The elderly librarian who never asked why I spent lunch periods hidden between shelves of worn books. Mrs. Rojas would smile and say, "Books are good friends, Miguel. They never judge." But books couldn't shield me from reality forever. That autumn morning started like any other, with me trying to make myself invisible as I walked to school. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and tortillas from morning cook fires, and somewhere in the distance, a rooster was still announcing dawn's arrival with misplaced enthusiasm. I almost made it to the schoolyard gate before Marco's voice shattered my careful anonymity. "Hey, Cabardi, did you finish the math homework? I need to copy it." Something shifted inside me then, like tectonic plates grinding beneath the surface of my carefully constructed world. Maybe it was the way the morning light caught the edge of a broken bottle near my feet, making it gleam like a fallen star. Maybe it was the remembered warmth of my mother's words from the night before. Courage isn't about not feeling fear, mijito. It's about facing it. The words burst from me like water through a breaking dam. I'm not a coward. My voice carried across the schoolyard with a strength that surprised even me. I'm not afraid of anything. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush mountains. Marco's eyebrows rose slowly, his mouth curving into something between a smile and a sneer. "Is that so?" he asked, his voice honeyed with false sweetness. "Then you won't mind proving it." The other boys gathered around us like crows, sensing entertainment. Marco's smile widened as he laid out his challenge. "The crossroads past the old church, tonight. Bring back one of those special crickets that sing there after dark." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Unless you're too scared." Everyone knew about those crossroads. They marked the boundary between the familiar world of our town and something else. A place where old stories still held power, where grandmothers made the sign of the cross when passing after sunset. The crickets there sang differently, people said, their songs carrying echoes of ancient things better left undisturbed. "I'll do it," I heard myself say, as if someone else was speaking through my mouth. "Tonight." The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxiety and regret. Even Mrs. Rojas noticed something was wrong, asking, "Everything all right, Miguel?" As I huddled in my usual corner with an unopened book. I managed to nod, but my stomach felt like it was hosting a butterfly migration. Night arrived too quickly, spreading across the sky like spilled ink. I waited until my mother's breathing grew steady in the next room before slipping out of bed, fully dressed. The floor creaked beneath my feet. Another betrayal in a night that already felt like a mistake in the making. The streets were empty, houses dark, except for occasional windows glowing like cat's eyes in the darkness. The old church rose against the star-scattered sky, its bell tower a black cutout against the moon's silver face. Beyond it, The road stretched toward the crossroads like a river of shadows. Each step felt heavier than the last. The cricket's song grew louder as I approached, their chorus rising and falling like waves against a distant shore. The crossroads opened before me like a wound in the landscape. 4 paths met beneath an explosion of stars, each direction leading somewhere I couldn't quite see. The cricket's song surrounded me now, their voices weaving patterns that seemed almost like words in a language I'd forgotten I knew. Then, between one heartbeat and the next, the singing stopped. The silence that followed felt alive, pressing against my ears like cotton wool. That's when I heard her voice, soft as falling leaves. "What brings you out so late, little one? All alone at the crossroads?" She stood in the center of the crossing, where I could have sworn no one had been a moment before. Her white dress caught the moonlight strangely, seeming to absorb it rather than reflect it. Her hair moved in a wind I couldn't feel, long, dark strands dancing like smoke signals. I'm looking for a cricket," I stammered, my voice small against the enormous silence, "to prove I'm not a coward." "Ah," she sighed, the sound like autumn leaves scraping across stone. "Come closer then, let me help you find what you seek." I took one step forward, then another. She remained perfectly still, patient as a spider in its web. When I was close enough to see her face, the moonlight shifted, and something inside me broke like glass. Where features should have been, bone gleamed pale as old ivory. Empty sockets held pinpricks of light that might have been stars reflected in dark water, or might have been something else entirely. Her smile was too wide, too full of teeth that gleamed like broken mirrors. Terror grabbed me, with hands made of ice. I ran, my feet barely touching the ground, the sound of her laughter following me like a shadow. It might have been seconds or hours before I reached my house, diving through my window and burying myself under blankets that suddenly seemed as flimsy as paper against the night's horrors. The next day, Marco waited by the school gate with his usual smirk. "Well, where's our cricket, Cobardi?" I looked at him for a long moment, seeing him clearly, perhaps for the first time. Just another boy, trying to make himself feel bigger by making others feel small. "I went to the crossroads," I said quietly. "I faced what was there. That's enough." Something in my voice must have carried the weight of truth, because he stepped back, his smirk faltering. He never called me Cabard again, though sometimes I caught him looking at me strangely, as if trying to solve a puzzle he couldn't quite understand. Years have passed since that night. I've grown up, left that small town for a life in the city where streetlights chase away the darkness and crickets are drowned out by traffic. But sometimes, on very quiet nights, I hear a familiar song cutting through the urban noise. A cricket's call that sounds almost like words in a language I wish I could forget. And sometimes, when I'm driving late at night and come to an empty intersection, I catch a glimpse of white in my peripheral vision, a suggestion of movement where no movement should be. In those moments, I remember what real fear tastes like and what real courage means. Not the absence of fear, but the wisdom to know when to face it and when to run.